In this next segment, D&D Rule Solution, we talk about the uncleared corners of the player's handbook, and we also talk about how my green screen is not cropped properly. There we go. We'll fix that right quick. And there we go. Production on the fly is the name of the game. So in D&D Rule Solution, we talk about some of the uncleared corners in the player's handbook and some of the official source books from Wizards of the Coast. This week, after last week, we jumped further into character creation. So last week we talked about my approach to building character, starting with backstory, then going into class, then going into race, and then finally abilities, which is a bit of a backwards approach. But one of the things I wanted to start with on D&D Rule Solution this week is levels 1 to 3. Which level should characters start at? Every DM and game will have a different approach to this, and of course it is preference. Typically the game starts with characters at level 1, but a lot of GMs tend to favor starting at level 3 for a number of reasons. That's when the majority of classes gain their subclasses and archetypes. It kind of fleshes out customization a little bit, gets players ahead in the game, and gives them a little bit more or a few more tools to work with. They also have their sub and all their specializations. In addition to that, they're a lot less squishy at level 3. So as we know, level 1 and 2 characters are fairly vulnerable. So for that reason, a lot of DMs will opt to start their characters at level 3. The flip side of that is a lot of DMs are also opting to or experimenting with starting players at level 0. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, so let me know if you have. It's been something that I've been toying with as well. But starting players with level 0 basically makes them commoners with stories, just like you and I. I guess we're commoners. No, we're all heroes in our own right, I guess, but we're all heroes. But, a common level character, let's say no real vocation, no class, no selection, anything like that. You just basically have your background, your history, your culture, your ancestry, all that good stuff. When you start at level 0, then your story begins, and then you can play through how they became what they are, which I think is a really interesting nuance to bring into the game. It's not something I'd probably recommend first time out of the gate, but it is something that I'm toying with in my game to see how that plays. So from there, you gain experience, which is normalized, of course, across all classes. So every class levels up at the same time in D&D 5e. There's no change to it. And then you kind of grow regardless of your class makeup. So level 2 is 300 experience. Level 3 is 900 experience, no matter what you are. So it really lends to that type of idea of whether you're going to start at level 0 and grow through. Level 2 is kind of the in-between. Of course, it happens quickly. I typically tend to lean towards level 1 personally. Because I really feel like those evolutionary defining moments in a character's saga are some of the most precious. And there's nothing that really excites me much more than getting into a new game or starting with a new character from the ground up and watching them build and grow. The other thing that starting at level 3 does have a tendency to do is it might be too much, especially for new players. They don't get to grow into those characters and learn the skills. But it's kind of a sweet spot between having a whole bunch of things to learn and having enough to work with and being thick enough or tough enough to survive encounters without being jeopardized all the time. So typically I would think about either starting at level 1 or maybe 0, the pre-levels, or starting at level 3. So what's your choice, I wonder? The next thing we're talking about in D&D Rule Solution is then optimizing your ability scores for your class or archetype. So abilities obviously are at the crux of how a player's class will flesh out or define them. Now there's arguments on both sides of abilities for class, from do what you want to do or what you feel makes sense for your character, right up to and including your hardcore min-maxers who want everything to mathematically be optimized, right? And both are totally viable ways to play the game. Nothing is wrong, of course, in D&D, as we know. They're just different styles. So ideally, though, I would say that you want your primary stat to be the main stat, or you want your primary stat for the class to be the highest that you have. So your character will suffer in the progression if you don't. If you ever kind of jip your character of what their primary stat is, then they're going to have some trouble catching up and keeping up. Their powers are going to suffer a little bit. So the only caveat I would make there is you probably want your highest stat to be that primary stat, like strength for fighters or dex for dexterity-based fighters, dexterity for rogues, whatever your spellcasting mod is for spellcasters. You definitely want to plunk one of your highest stats in there. There's a different kind of focus for hybrids. So if you're playing a hybrid type class like Ranger or Eldritch Knight Fighter or an Arcane Trickster Rogue, then you probably want to land your second most or at least your third most highest stat in that secondary stat, whether it's wisdom, intelligence, whatever your spellcasting trait is, to make sure that you're not like, nerfing out your character too much right from the get-go. Beyond that, there are a couple of simple mechanical benefits that I'll offer for each ability and what they mean and what they directly influence. So, strength is simply attack power from melee weapons. Dexterity is attack power for ranged weapons if you have that type of character, and finesse weapons. So this is a type of weapon that draws from dexterity rather than strength, like rapiers, short swords, daggers. These are finesse weapons which allow you to use either dexterity or strength. Keep in mind too that dexterity also affects armor class, which is important to everyone. So some of these stats are a little bit more powerful across the board, and some of them are a little bit more focused on each. Constitution affects your core hit points. So, and they're retroactive for levels. So if you increase your constitution, you get a new modifier. You get to apply that modifier for all the levels of hit points you had previously too. So when you think constitution, think hit points, mechanically speaking. Intelligence is spellcasting power for wizards. It's also secondary for some hybrid classes like Eldritch Knights and Trickster Rogues. Wisdom is a spellcasting modifier for clerics, druids. It's also hybrid for some classes like rangers, so you want to pay attention to that. And then, of course, charisma is a spellcasting modifier for sorcerers, and it's secondary for some hybrids like paladins. Charisma is also a spellcasting modifier, a stat for warlocks as well. I also call charisma jokingly and lovingly the RP stat, because under charisma you'll find a lot of the skills that are really RP centric. Insight, insight, persuasion, intimidation, all those kinds of skills that really come in handy when you're engaging with not just your players, but NPCs and the game world itself. So I call it loosely the RP stat. Some things to think about. Those are the core mechanics that are attached to each ability when you're placing those things. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the more narrative use of ability scores. So beyond just the core mechanics, if you're kind of trying to optimize a little bit, but you also want to understand how these abilities play in narratively, I look at it simply like this. Strength is your physical prowess, your might, the active strength and feats of strength and pure raw muscular power, let's say. Dexterity is simply agility, nimbleness, and coordination, manual speed, acuity, and your awareness of quick twitch interactions, let's say. Constitution can be loosely considered your toughness, withstanding external factors like weather, hazards, and other kind of things that influence your character from a physical level that can affect your, let's say, health, for lack of a better word. Intellect or intelligence is your academia and book smarts, as I would call them. Very analytical in nature, anything that requires analysis or something in the moment, very sharp in nature. You think about keen minds or sharp minds, that's where intelligence really lives. Wisdom is your worldly experience, or the opposite of that, or let's say the complement to that, which is street smarts, right? So beyond your book smarts learning, this is your experience in the world, your situational awareness, your personal instincts, and how you react to the environment based on your life's experience. Charisma is not good looks, okay? Charisma is not how good looking you are or not. Charisma is an overall presence. Think about of your person, your influence, demeanor, your personal centering and projection. It's your personal awareness. I would say, if anything that's close to that, it's attraction, but in a much more holistic sense. So that attraction is a combination of a lot of things. It's how confident you are, how you present, how you articulate, how you interact with one another, how you network, how you build relationships. That is charisma. It's not how cool your hair is or how pretty you might be. Next up on D&D Rule Solution, I'm going to talk a little bit about proficiencies. And when it comes to proficiencies and what you're selecting for your character, first of all, I would recommend checking with your DM on this. And this is something that I think kind of gets overlooked a little bit. When you're thinking about the proficiencies for your character, you're choosing what skills your character wants to be well-versed in or proficient in, I would check in with your DM, because see if your DM will be willing to share with you, or GM will be willing to share with you, especially when it comes to languages and things like that. See if what you're choosing is going to be beneficial to the campaign you're going into. Like, for example, nature might not be great for a heavy dungeon delving type campaign, or if you're stuck underground, or if you're stuck in a particular scenario where nature maybe not is that beneficial. You don't want to regret those choices. Now, not all DMs will be open to that. Obviously, that's their choice, but it might be worth having a conversation. Say, this is what I'm thinking about. Am I going to gain some benefit from this, or is it going to be beneficial in this type of campaign or party? For example, language is a big one there too. If you learn Celestial or Abyssal, it might not be useful if you're going into like a Goblin heavy or Underdark campaign, right? So I think it's always worthwhile to check in with your DM on that before you pick those proficiencies, especially if you're on the fence. Just say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is the kind of build I'm looking at. Do you think it'll be of value, or will I have a good time and get the use of it in that type of campaign? I would be totally open with my characters, my players with that. I don't think there's any spoiler or any, you're not giving up anything that they shouldn't know if you are telling them that, like, hey, you might want to think about, like, your favorite terrain. Forest, yeah, there's always going to be some forests around. You might think about, like, mountain, urban, too. There's a little bit of everything. I don't think there's any harm in having that conversation with your players or your DM. Remember to choose your backstory proficiencies first. This one's key too, because backstories come with proficiencies that are tied to those backstories. They're immobile. They're static, right? Dungeon Mistress with another tier 1 sub gift to MVCDM. Thank you very much, Dungeon Mistress. And MVCDM, welcome to the Checkmates. Please do enjoy your subscription. I'll be looking at fleshing that out. I definitely have the right motivation to make sure I understand what my sub rewards are going to be, so you'll all be a big part of that, and I'll put some effort into that this week, definitely. I want to make sure that there's some real merit to subscribing on the channel to show you the love back. Thank you again, Dungeon Mistress, for continuing to be so generous today and supporting the stream. And MVC, welcome to the Checkmates. We now official. Thanks for joining us today, and hope you're enjoying the stream too. For everyone, of course, if you are enjoying what you see, just toss me a simple follow, free of charge. Show me the love. Definitely show me that you're listening, and what we do matters. Of course, I'm just happy to have you along with me on this ride this Saturday morning, and every Saturday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern time and 8 a.m. Pacific time. Tiny plug. Select your background proficiencies first, because your class will give you the option of several proficiencies, but your background comes with proficiencies baked in. So you want to make sure that those are calculated so that you can then pick your class proficiencies around that, so you don't duplicate and end up wasting proficiency slots, right? Because they're precious. You only get between like 3 to 5, depending on your makeup. Beyond that, remember that spellcasters can't spellcasts. Spellcasters cannot cast spells in armor they're not proficient with, and you can take armor proficiencies, right? So if you want to wear armor as a caster, you can, but just know that you can't cast spells if you're not proficient in that type of armor. So when you're selecting your proficiencies, keep that in mind too when it comes to armor proficiencies. Finally, around proficiencies, I want to talk about tool proficiencies specifically and how they work. This is one that often gets confused. Of course, everyone uses it a little bit differently. And like I said before, there's no wrong way to do it. But tool proficiencies, particularly when you're picking locks, let's say some DMs will use like a sleight of hand, some DMs will use like a basic dex check. Really what it's supposed to be is you have to be proficient in thieves' tools, and then it's a tool proficiency check, which is simply a dexterity check with your proficiency bonus if you're proficient in those tools. So for example, if you're going to unlock a door or pick a lock, you need to have a set of thieves' tools, and you need to be proficient with those tools in order to do it effectively. Anyone can try anything in D&D. That's part of the beauty of it. But if you are really trying to substantiate that with a proficient check, it's a dex check with proficiency, which essentially is your dexterity bonus plus your proficiency bonus. The reason a lot of DMs will use sleight of hand or something that they're proficient in is because effectively, mathematically, it's the same. But if you're proficient in thieves' tools and you're trying to pick a lock and I call for a sleight of hand check and you're not proficient in sleight of hand, I'm robbing you of your proficiency bonus for this thieves' tools. So those are things to keep in mind when you're calling for those checks, DMs out there, and players for you to be aware of. Finally, in D&D Rule Solution this week, I'm talking about other official forms of rolling or creating your ability checks. There are 3 main ones. So one of the original ones that had always kind of surfaced back in 2E, maybe beyond, was the roll 4, keep 3 method. So this is where you roll 4 6-sided dice, 4 d6s, and you keep the top 3 results. It really creates a lot of diversity amongst characters. A lot of players like it because it gives them the opportunity to be maybe a little bit more than standard powerful. But it also comes with the caveat that you can also end up pretty low on that scale too. The potential to be really high and potential low depending on how you roll, unless they're house ruled, unless this process is also house ruled. So it's often considered the most exciting way to generate abilities by players because you can roll multiple 18s. It's the only way to really get an 18 as a level 1. And it adds an automatic layer of customization and diversity to your party, right? You're going to have all kinds of rolls all over the table. And that's sometimes exciting for a lot of players, unless you're the player who rolled like 4 6s. So that might be a little bit different. because of that, it is often house ruled by a lot of DMs. There are a lot of different ways to do that. So some examples that I've seen used in the past is that you get to either re-roll your ones, right? If you roll a 1 when you're rolling up those abilities in roll 4, pick 3, you re-roll your ones, which gives you a bit of a better chance. Another thing I've seen is you get a bonus 7th stat roll, and then you drop your lowest one. These are all ways that I think DMs over the course of history have tried to curb the randomness of roll 4, pick 3. But it also has the adverse effect too, is if somebody rolls really good, they're just rolling really good, and then you could end up with some really tweaked, hyper powerful characters too. The second one, and the one that I use mostly, is stat array. So that is where you get a predefined set of stats. They are 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8. And then you can plot those anywhere in your character. A couple of words of caution or tips for that, though, is just remember, first of all, this will give you a guaranteed plus modifier for at least 3 stats, a neutral for 1, which is your 10, and a negative stat, which is your 8. So when you're placing these, keep in mind that modifiers are granted every even number or integer. So 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. So when you're placing these, you don't want to put your 15 somewhere where you have a +2 because it's going to make it a 17. And there's no net difference between a 16 and a 17. So what I usually try and do is place my +2 modifier based on your race, your racial bonuses. I would give my 14 to that, so it'll make that 14 a 16. And where you always have a +1, or if you have a +1 in your racial benefits, I would use that in my 15. So now I have 2 16s to work with, if that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. So it's a fun way to kind of play with that. It allows your players to make their characters without any witnessing or anything like that. It keeps things really well balanced. The third and final one that's used to generate ability scores is point buy. And point buy is where PCs start with a pool of 27 points that they can use to purchase abilities. And those abilities have a menu of costs. Really loosely put, like a skill score of 8 costs 0 points. Skill set of 9 costs 1 point. Skill set of 10 costs 3 points. So you buy these points based on what's left in your pool, and you subtract it from your currency of 27 points to spend. Loosely put, really an easy way to understand is like 8 to 13 is 1 point, like +1 point. So it starts with 8 at 0, and then you add 1 point for every score. So 9 is 1, 10 is 2, 11 is 3, and 13 is 4. And then all the way up to 13, and 14 and 15 to buy are 9. I feel like I'm making that more confusing, actually. Just check out the menu in the player's handbook, because each ability score you want to buy comes with a cost for those points. A better way to think about it is basically the 26 points, if you spread them out evenly, will give you either 5 13s, so 5 13s for a score, and 1 10, or you could do 5 12s and 1 14. So you can balance them out that way. This actually makes humans a really attractive option too, because humans get a +1 across all their stats. So you can actually suddenly have a plus modifier for all of your stats there. For example, if you put those 13s, if you go with 5 13s and 1 10, you're going to end up with 5 14s, which is really tough to get any other way. So yeah, it's worth looking into. It's a little bit of a different system. It also gives your players the ability to roll their stats and create their characters without your oversight, which kind of takes things out of your hands and gives more power to your players, which is not really a bad thing either. Next week on Rule Solution, we're moving more into the character sheet. We're going to be going through the character sheet and talking about racial bonuses and backgrounds and how they factor in, and actually creating your character, putting it all together, and getting ready to roll some dice and dive into that adventure. So I hope you join me for that.